Welcome to Brew Crime, the podcast where we drink brews, talk volcanoes, true crime, conspiracies, or whatever catches our attention. This is Mike and my co-host.
I'm erupting. I'm not. This is JT.
That seems a very personal thing to say at the start of the episode. Jeez.
It is. Just a hint to everybody out there. Don't yell I'm erupting. Don't do that while you're doing that. That's not something you want to, I mean, you do you. I don't care. But so this is part 2 of our coverage of natural disasters, specifically volcanoes this go around.
Yes. But this time it's not a long time ago.
No, not at all. At all.
No.
It's fairly recent, relatively recent, about 4 or 5 years ago, tops.
Yeah.
You think I'd know since I wrote it, but hey, we're going to find it out together. I love writing because I forget about it by the time I sing it, I say it.
Exactly.
But yeah, so we are covering White Island, and the title of this is, and there's another name to it too, but White Island Covered in Ash is what I'm calling it. And we'll get into my lovely beer pairing here, which it's a loose connection, but I have chosen Sapporo, and the reason is because it's an international beer. This is an international story. There we go.
Yeah. What country is this in again?
This is in New Zealand.
Oh, okay.
Am I right?
I don't remember.
Yes, New Zealand.
Okay.
It's New Zealand. This is Japanese beer, but
kind of, sort of ish close.
Good luck finding New Zealand beer. I'm not saying they don't have any, but I've never had any.
We used to get actually a couple different New Zealand breweries here, but that's gone away.
Oh no. Okay.
Oh.
ASMR warning. After the ASMR. So Sapporo is basically, it's a lager, right?
Yeah.
4.9%. It is really good to pair with pretty much anything. And I
Mostly
like the
sushi.
fact that right? Yes. I like a light beer with sushi. Especially when I'm downing it like it's my job, or like I paid a certain amount and I want to get my money's worth.
Yeah, but the only time I'll drink that stuff is if I'm doing all you can eat sushi.
I like the end of this because it's like "Kampai," which I really
Kampai.
Like. So
Down the hatch.
it's super light. I'm really, people aren't surprised. I can't describe beer. It's just really good. Well,
it's probably like
it.
mildly grainy. Maybe it's probably got some rice in there. I think it's a rice based beer.
And I will say this, and I mentioned this to you earlier off show, but it is much better in Japan.
Well, it hasn't sat in a ship for how long? Getting here.
Correct.
Or it was made here in a brewery and not to the same standard. Who knows?
Right. Well,
it happens a lot.
Sir, before I really get started, how are you doing? Hopefully well.
Not too bad. As of the recording day, it was a nice, fairly warm day for this time of year and beautiful sunny day. So not bad. No volcanic eruptions today.
That's good.
Yeah.
Or bad, depending on how you're defining that. But
true,
all right.
True. How about you, sir?
Oh, I'm fine. I've got a kid who had a stomach bug. So that's been great.
Okay. A kid with a stomach bug, you don't say.
I mean, you listen, take an adult having a stomach bug and turn it into a kid who isn't quite sure what's going on, and there you go,
Yeah. Fun times.
So that being said, and on the same line of eruptions, Mother Nature is a real piece of work.
Yeah.
That's how I'm starting it. But you can only blame her so much as we've kind of, fucked around and now we're finding out.
Absolutely.
This is how this works. But this story is a bit more than that. And this story has twists and turns, a bit of governmental play with laws, keeping some of the first responders from doing what they were trained to do. It wouldn't be my kind of story if I didn't mention that.
True.
So in addition, I would also like to say that I am a tad bit of a thrill seeker. Do I get the option to do many thrilling things? Nope. Not any longer.
Oh, I am. Even
And
even after knowing this story, I
yeah,
still go there.
there's still a piece, right? But
Yeah.
like, so like my definition of thrilling is pretty much at this point getting pictures from Mike. That's that's my definition of thrilling at this point.
Oh,
Um,
jeez.
I
Nature
can
pictures.
say
Nature pictures.
right, exactly. I'm so glad you. Oh my God. All right. Well, now that we've got everybody asking questions, I'm not going to answer them. So if I can say that if I had a chance, and if I read the description of the excursion, I would 100% have done what I'm about to explain to you. And I might still do it, like you just mentioned.
I would. Yeah.
We're about to find out, though, that a calculated risk, even when dealing with an excursion on a vacation, is still just that. It's a
Yep.
risk.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot to this story. Some of it involves timeline of events because I think that's probably the best way to explain it all. But I want to give credit to a couple of very important sources. Very rarely have I limited my sources to just 2 to 4. Usually you'll find a super long list.
Yeah.
But there were 2 main sources that I used for this. One is the documentary "The Volcano Rescue from Whakaari." Whakaari?
Something like that. Yeah. Which is
Yeah,
the
we're
indigenous
gonna go with
name.
Whakaari. Yes, it is. It's the indigenous. White Island is one of the very few places that has both an English name and an indigenous name together.
Yeah.
So the director of that was Rory Kennedy. The executive producers Brian Grazer and Ron Howard. Score produced by Hans Zimmer, which I thought was pretty freaking cool. But
Yeah.
you can find that on Netflix.
And it is an extremely well done miniseries, and also, oh my God.
Yeah, and so so that documentary is based off of an article called "The True Story of the White Island Eruption," which was by Alex Perry, and he's a contributing editor to Outside, and that was published April 15th, 2020. So if you want to go back to the original source, it's "The True Story of the White Island Eruption." You can find it. There's no paywall, so you can check that out if you're more of a reader than a viewer. And so there's a lot of stuff in there too.
Yeah.
So Whakaari, or White Island, is actually one of the very few places, like I said, that has 2 names. One name is from the indigenous people, and one is ascribed by explorers, or rather Captain James Cook.
Yes.
Because, of course it is. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. So the island is New Zealand's most active cone volcano, and it's actually 48 kilometers, almost 30 miles offshore. And it has become what is today it has become what it is today due to the continuous volcanic activity, which goes on far past 150,000 years. So what it is a highly reactive hydrothermal system. And that system expresses itself as hot springs and mud pools, fumaroles, and acid streams and lakes. That's right. You heard me right. Acid streams and lakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, this is not Lord of the Rings, right? So
it might be Mount Doom, but it's not.
So the present Center for Volcanic Activity and Outgassing which outgassing is what my wife calls me after Taco Bell, is a large crater lake of boiling acidic waters located in the western subcrater. Now this island covers around 325 hectares. Hectares, thank you, or 1.25 square miles. So it's not a lot.
Acres. No, acres.
Acres. Good point. That's fair. So although it's small, that section is only 30% of the volcano's entire mass. The rest is under the sea. Now, how far under the sea do you say? 1,600 meters, or 5,250 feet below.
Yeah,
which
she's
is
a biggie.
Insane. So Captain Cook, like I said, named the island White Island in 1769. The full name is Te Pua o Whakaari, the dramatic volcano. That's what that stands for.
Yeah, now it's pretty well named.
Yeah, it is. There is some argument about James Cook naming that White Island. They think it has a lot to do with the smoke. They also say that it has something to do with the amount of birds that actually could live there. And then there was a bunch of shit everywhere, and so he called it White Island. So there's a lot of different.
They got off their ship and it was suddenly whiter.
You know what? Not wrong. So the name changed to the full name in 97, and it's privately owned. It was declared a private scenic reserve in 1953. There was a sulfur mining venture actually on the island in the late 1800s.
Oh wow.
And this, yeah, I know, right? I work on a volcano. This lasted until 1914, and it ended because part of the crater wall collapsed. The landslide destroyed the mine and the village the miners lived in while they were there, and 10 people died.
They fucked around and found out.
And they tried to do it again in the
Oh,
1920s.
Jesus.
And boy, oh boy, did that end quickly as well. So here's a description I found from someone who went on tour there. Quote, the landscape of the island is nothing if not completely otherworldly. It's a vista of gray andesite rock, bright yellow sulfur vents with white billowing clouds of steam rising above them, and eerily clear boiling streams. In the middle of it all is the Caldera Lake, with its enticing light turquoise water and plumes of steam coming off the surface. If you didn't hear the guide mention the negative 0.5 pH, you could easily mistake it for nature's jacuzzi, with one little caveat. This hot tub can melt your bones.
Yes. But it is gorgeous. Beautiful.
It really is, right? You know, they say some of the most fun is not good for you.
Truth.
As I
Cheers.
drink a beer. So a lot of this centers around the company White Island Tours. So White Island Tours, owned by, I'm going to guess it's Nagati Iowa Tourism, since 2017, was the company. So there isn't a lot about their history overall. I can tell you that they have suspended all trips to White Island indefinitely.
Yes.
But they do continue to take touring groups to Whale Island, which is a sanctuary. It's home to endangered plants, birds, and reptiles. And I will say this, that trip is pretty reasonable. To do that is only, and that includes boat and docking fees and everything, $80 US, 109 Canadian.
That's not bad at all, yeah.
That's not bad for like a completely unbothered sanctuary.
No, that's amazing. Yeah. I mean, White Island is endangered humans, but yeah.
Right. So here's where we get into the event. The eruption occurred on December 9th, 2019, and it was extremely fast. Everything was quiet at 2:10 p.m. and at 2:11 p.m. there was a 2-mile high tower of steam. 1 minute, boom.
Yeah.
And on top of that, there was a 60-mile-per-hour gas and rock tsunami. So the next line will confuse you. Tourists arrived. Tourists arrived to the tour company. They read the safety documents. They signed the necessary things. They had some idea of risk through this, but there's no way, there's nothing that could have prepared them for this.
No.
The tourists came from a cruise ship and a few other locations. In total, there were 100 tourists that were heading out on a 6-hour tour. Now, the tourists came in 3 boats. 2 of those boats, the ones most important to this, are the Phoenix and Te Pua Whakaari. The first boat had left by the time of the eruption, which is what we didn't mention. There also were a few German clients who arrived via helicopter flown by Brian DePaul. So the first boat came and left. The Phoenix had just departed. The Te Pua, I'm going to call it the TPW. That's what I'm going to call the other boat, just to save myself from the, just to save myself from mispronouncing. It's better for everybody. So the TPW still had its passengers walking back, as well as some tourists still at the crater about to leave. Yeah. And it was about 47 people left on the island. So the trail they hiked, the trail they hike up to the crater is essentially a circle. Up on one side, down on another. It connects at a small inlet where the boats load and unload.
And I mean, all the best hiking trails are loops, really, anyways, right? So you can see different things as you're going.
There is nothing I hate more than an out and back.
I do a lot of them, but yes, it's much nicer when it's a circle. Although I've also been on some loops that I wish that I didn't do the loop in the end, and I was too tired to go back, and I had to go through, and it was really rough.
We've come too far.
Yes.
That's how I feel when I walk down the end of the hall. Like, I've come too far. I don't want to go back.
Oh my.
Around 2 p.m., they were looking into the crater, and they basically saw, quote, a gaping, never-ending pit of steam. And that was a photo opportunity for everyone, as it was basically an acid lake.
Yeah.
They weren't able to stay long, though, because even with gas masks on, basically gas masks,
Yeah.
it wasn't good for them. So that tells you, even without the eruption, just how bad that would be long term, right?
Oh yeah, no, it is not a healthy spot to be, but it is a
Mm-mm.
beautiful place to be.
Yeah. So part of the group was rushing back to the jetty, and they were halfway there. A few of the group was still up there, and someone said, "Hey, look at that." Now listen, note to everybody, if someone says that, don't look back. Just go
Not
away.
not at a volcano, no.
Right? So immediately a black cloud came flying out of the volcano. Now, it is important to note that there is basically a white cloud of steam that comes out of that volcano consistently. You can see it from the main island,
Yeah.
right? So that's not a surprise to anybody. However, this black cloud came flying out, and they took a second to take
Almost
photos, and then they
erupting out.
realized, huh?
Almost erupting out.
Right? Almost like that. And of course, they took a second to take photos, and they were like, "Oh shit!" And they realized what was happening. Then a larger blast happened, and then a larger one with rocks flying through the air. The plume immediately became taller than the island. They heard someone shout, "Run!" And they were running for their life as a shadow rose behind them. We're going to take a pause just to kind of talk about the type of eruption. Volcanologists are pretty sure that the eruption was phreatomagmatic. There we go. Whew.
Well said.
Basically, it's a combination of steam and magma. That's what that is.
Magma.
Right? Liquid hot magma.
I wonder if Dr. Evil lived here.
100. Okay.
$1 million.
Mini me, you complete me. So this eruption would have started from a fault movement deep in the earth, and then it was given more upward force by gases from the liquids as it rose and depressurized. So basically, it's what happens with a soda bottle.
Yeah.
That's what you're looking at. So, quote, these processes would have released enough explosive energy to shoot steam 12,000 feet into the air and blow a deadly wave of hot rock, ash, and acid gas.
It's like dropping Mentos into a Diet Coke, but with acid and fire.
I was with you until you said acid and fire. Not the kind of viral video I want to be a part of.
No.
All right, so let's go back to the story. The tourists sheltered behind any rocks they could find just before the ash cloud enveloped them. And there wasn't anything that they could do. That was it. The first boat was on its way around the island to leave when the eruption happened. And the eruption was basically described by the people on that boat as beautiful, an awesome moment, and something that turned quickly sinister. The ash cloud came over and down the cliff, and the boat sped out of the way as the crew called for all tourists to get inside. Brian DePaw, the helicopter pilot I mentioned in the beginning, said that it was basically just a wall of smoke and projectiles. His helicopter was 300 to 400 meters away. He wasn't able to make it there. He ran to the pier with the people who were with him, and he hollered for them to jump in the water and stay under. And he held his breath as long as possible. And everything went black. That's horrifying, especially with the knowledge that if you come up for air, chances are you ain't going to get it. I can't imagine. And he kind of waited for as long as he could until he saw some kind of sky. And he kind of saw it and then it'd go away. And then, so that just messes with my head.
Yeah.
So rocks were hitting and pelting people's hard hats. It was darker than any night any tourist had ever seen. And the quote from this is, people don't walk out of this. So people were yelling, and as they were running away, the back of many of them felt like it was being burnt off. And they said that it burned so fast that they didn't even feel it at first. The smell and the heat were unbearable, and all some could do was lay in the fetal position to let their back take the brunt of the force. And they were screaming in pain, and it burned through all their clothes for the 2 to 3 minutes of the eruption. Not only that, But they found that in a good chunk, a good group of these folks that made it, and we'll talk about this, make it back on the boat, it burnt past the clothes to the skin and left the clothes intact, but the skin was burned underneath. I've never heard of something like that,
No,
but that's what they're saying happened.
it's an absolute fucking nightmare. Like that nightmare
It
fuel,
is.
right?
It
There's
is hell on
probably,
earth.
well, yeah, it's being like burned alive, right? Like awful.
Yes. The Phoenix that left that boat could not see the island at all. Ash fell on the surface of the water. It fell down onto the island, screaming, shouting, crying, rolling around on the ground. It was terrible. But then things stopped and it got quiet. And many of the tourists who could get back up figured that it was absolutely now or never. So they attempted to walk back to the jetty. Many of them burned over 60 to 90+% of their skin. So they were also at times surrounded by steam that was 200 degrees Celsius, which is 392 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically, they're running on pure adrenaline.
Yeah, well, I mean, 100 Celsius is boiling water, so it's twice boiling water.
Thank you, because I did not put it in here, but that's an
No,
important.
but I mean that it really goes to show how fucking hot that was. That is insane.
And like I said, I'm glad you said that because I think with situations like this, it's hard to put yourself there unless you have something relative to consider, and that is something relative to consider. I would not be putting my hand on a stove or an oven,
No.
right?
I
So
mean,
you
those
can
are
only
probably
imagine.
temperatures that you'd find inside an Instapot, right? Because once it gets to steam, it's hotter, right? Like,
Right.
you do not want to be in that kind of temperature.
Yeah, and so like the helicopter pilot who jumped into the water, Brian, thought that there was no way anybody could have survived. But he saw 20 or so people walking to the pier waiting to be helped. And the Phoenix skipper got the boat back. And the Phoenix skipper basically went into the shadow of the ash cloud. So at first glance, those folks looked okay. But upon closer inspection, the group's clothes were covered in ash. They were gray. One woman's legs were blackened. I can only imagine just like that scene.
Yeah.
And as you know, there's something that Brian mentions in the documentary, and it's that he was trying to get people into the boat to get to the main boat. And as he was grabbing people's hands, I mean, their skin was just sliding off. And I don't say that to gross people out, but again, you have to understand how burnt they were.
Yeah.
And these folks were all in shock. There wasn't, I mean, you couldn't do anything. You just had to get them on the boat.
Yeah. I think in some ways it's almost better that they were in shock.
Oh,
because of
for
how
sure.
bad off they were.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So of course the Phoenix called the Coast Guard. Not much happened there. Not really. They looked out and saw the plume. We're going to get more into the official rescue efforts eventually. But as mentioned, the Phoenix went back. The captain and his crew picked up all, 19 or 20 passengers in a series of runs as they were helping people onto the boats. It was just bad. So the Phoenix's skipper started heading back to Whakatane. The captain for TPW, the other boat, was going to make a final sweep of the shore. So he was pretty sure there wasn't anybody left who could be rescued. He didn't see anybody until he was just about to turn around and leave. And that's when Jesse Langford, who's 19, who was with one of the groups near the crater with his dad, mom, and sister, had somehow survived. And he pushed to make it down to the jetty in the hopes that he could get somebody to go and help the rest.
Yeah.
And Jesse was burned on 100% of his body. Like there was no spot untouched on him. He was put into that second boat, TPW, and that boat left. And I think that was the most emotional part for me.
Yeah,
being
me
a
too.
son with my family on a boat, knowing that it's leaving and they're still there. Yeah. So the captain of TPW, he actually stayed behind to continue the search since he knew another boat, the PJ4, was going to return after delivering the other passengers who were luckily lucky to leave before the eruption. And I want to take a second just to talk about this. This was mentioned in the documentary a couple of times, but it's the golden hour. And so there is something called the golden hour, which deals basically with traumatic injury. And that's the period of time immediately after traumatic injury where there is the highest likelihood that quick medical or surgical treatment will prevent death. So it's considered to be an hour after. But it obviously can be more or less. And while there's no evidence suggesting that survival rates drop after 60 minutes, some really kind of just use the term for quick intervention rather than just saying it's 1 hour and that's it, right? You want to get to them within an hour. So we've kind of talked about what's going on the island. We're going to kind of move a little bit into the helicopter rescue that happens, because there's a little bit that's happening everywhere. And I mentioned this to Mike, the different threads of this story and how they weave. It's difficult to do almost without a visual, right? But people around the island, in regards to those who knew about rescue, they knew about that golden hour. And of course, doing a search on land is only so impactful. You kind of have to have, you have the possible tourists near the crater, but you also need eyes in the sky to look for movement. And oddly enough, for a high tourist destination, there were no helicopters in the air that day. There were, however, a few citizen heroes that would take some incredible steps to save tourists, and see if anybody was still alive. And those fellows are Jason Hill, Tom Story, Mark Law, Tim Barrow, and John Funnell. So I'm going to describe a few things regarding flying in terms of helicopters leaving, and I'm probably going to keep the names away unless I think it's important to know what they did. But I did want to say the names right off the bat in case I did forget.
Yeah.
So Mark Law was a helicopter pilot along with Tim Barrow for Volcanic Air. Tom Story was the same. They said sitting back and doing nothing wasn't an option. And so they went to help. And it was you either do or you don't. So within a minute of hearing about the eruption and getting to the helicopters, they were up, fueled, flying to the islands. So fast.
Which is amazing, yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. So John Funnell himself was actually an airplane pilot, and Funnell pioneered New Zealand's search and rescue service. He just so happened to be teaching instrument approaches to a student, and so he heard about it. He landed, dropped off his student, and headed straight to the island. And while on the way, he ended up getting in contact with the helicopter folks. Helicopter and plane, they began working together. Funnell was going to circle the island and provide overhead radio cover. And in addition, he would relay messages basically to and from police and Coast Guard.
Yeah, which is really important.
It really is. And so within 10 minutes, boom, they're up, right? So the two copters lifted off at 2:50 and 3:05 in around 50 minutes to an hour after the eruption. But they got there really fast, much faster than a boat could.
Yeah, it was not close to shore. It was a long ways out.
So the Phoenix, which I mentioned earlier, was on its way with the injured, was speeding back. Now, passengers, burns, blistered. And something was mentioned, in the documentary that I hadn't thought of, which was, you've got the sun beating down on the water and the boat. These folks are burned. And you have the salt water coming off and splashing up and hitting them as well. And we all know with salt and injuries, and come on. It
might be antiseptic, but it also hurts like a motherfucker.
Yeah. And, Jeff Hopkins, who was a tourist who aided the injured on the 50-minute trip back, said you'd lift someone's shirt and the shirt was in perfect condition, but there would be terrible burns underneath it. And so at one point, the helicopters actually hovered and was going to airlift injured off the boat and back, but they were told a Coast Guard vessel was coming, so they followed the other copter that was headed for the island. And I'm not quite sure where the Coast Guard vessel ended because, the Phoenix ended up making it back.
Yeah.
And they were unloading people from the Phoenix. So I think what happened was they pulled alongside, and that was about it. They might have provided some help, but people like Jeff Hopkins were
Yeah.
doing
I
what
think
they
I
could.
remember I remember hearing, I think like they threw some medics on to the boat, but with those kind of burns, there's not much you can do with a field medical kit. Like you need to be in a hospital.
And I am again theme. I'm glad you mentioned that because Jeff
Yeah.
Hopkins had mentioned that like he couldn't do anything with what he was given in that big old first aid kit. The best thing that he could do was dump the shit out, fill the first aid kit with fresh water, and pour it on people.
Yeah.
And that's how he used that first aid kit. So we're gonna kind of fast forward to helicopters arriving. The Mark Law had spotted a large group of people on the crater floor, and they were only a couple hundred yards away from that acid lake. In an hour and a minute after the eruption, he touched down on the landing platform. And you might be asking me, but JT, what about the other helicopter that was there from the guy who jumped into the water with his passengers? Well, when the eruption occurred, the helicopter was shoved a distance large enough to clear that landing path, and it bent two of the rotors at almost 90-degree angles.
Yeah, it fucked it
That's the
up good.
force. Yeah. I mean, it was tossed, right? So these folks went to care for the people, whether they were alive, dying, or dead. It did not matter. They were going.
Yep.
And they basically checked person to person. The folks that were alive, they let them know help was coming because at that point, it was said that it was coming. So, quote, all 20 people that the pilots found here below the rim of the inner crater, forming a loose line along the path. Many of their burns were so severe that later, when the pilots saw pictures of the dead and missing on the news, they didn't recognize them. One adult was so disfigured it was impossible to tell whether they were a man or a woman. So, as they helped, they were able to get somewhat of a picture of what probably happened. And here it is, word for word. This is what they think happened. So, as three pilots worked, they were able to piece together some of what had happened. From where they were, the walkers would have seen the initial eruption. Behind a boulder, Story and Law came across a small pile of phones and tablets. Video from them would later confirm that several had stopped to film the steam cloud. What none of them could have seen until it crested the lip and consumed them was the horizontal blast of rock, ash, and acid mist. Many injuries were to their anterior sides, suggesting that they were facing it when it hit. Superintendent Andy McGregor, police district commander for the Bay of Plenty, said, in the ash was hydrochlor. Now, you mentioned this in the last episode.
Yep.
In the ash was hydrochloride, hydrofluoride, and sulfur dioxide. Mix those with water and you get hydrochloric acid. Hydrofluoric acid, which attacks calcium, and on top of that, sulfuric acid. So
Yeah.
you've got superheated gases, you've got the blast, and you've got the acid atmosphere. And imagine what that does.
Yeah. It burns and burns
Right.
and burns. Yeah.
Right?
From heat and acid,
Right.
which are
So,
different burns.
yeah. Oh, God, yes. Absolutely. And they're handled differently. Due to some laws being passed for various reasons, it was determined that, quote, rescues would never be to the detriment of flight safety. Now, the laws that are provided in the 59 pages of guidelines due to that only have one page being about patient safety. Everything else is about the rescuer safety. And I do understand it's important for that. But there's also people there. So in short, a rescue with the helo pilots, the rescue that they thought was coming, never was. They called them off and they kept them on the main island. So Mark Law said, let's move them out because he wasn't going to just leave them there.
No, God, no.
And so that was that. So Hill went back to get his copter and flew it up to the crater. Law and Story gathered any survivors because there were survivors at that point, even the ones right by the crater, which is, I mean,
Horrifying.
It's horrifying. They got Hill's copter loaded up, and then Mark Law went back for his copter. In short, they got as many people as possible, and they took off. By 4:07 p.m., everyone was landing. You had a helicopter and the Phoenix. In total, the pilots picked up 12 people in 40 minutes. In addition, they moved the dead together to make the extraction easier, which I can't put together in my head how hard that is.
Yeah.
Not only that, but Law tucked the owners' phones into their hands to make identification easier. So this guy knew what he was doing.
Yeah, definitely.
So afterwards, there were arguments over recovering the rest of the bodies. People wanted their loved ones back, but the police were being cautious. Now, Lee, Story, Barrow, and Hill thought they were being too cautious. They basically said, "We can retrieve the bodies and be back within 90 minutes. Like, just let us go." But
Yeah.
they wouldn't let them, and that wasn't going to be allowed. So 47 in total, 47 people were on White Island when the eruption occurred. 21 died, 24 were injured, and of the 12 that were flown out, 10 died, which I'm sure is
Yeah.
very difficult for those helo pilots.
Yeah. I mean, hey, they were able to save two.
Right.
That's
Right.
something.
Now, the survivors required a massive number of skin grafts. And I don't know if you know this stat about the total. So, New Zealand put out a global order for 33.8 square meters of skin grafts.
That's a lot.
That is the equivalent of 16 bodies worth.
A
Quote,
lot.
yeah. So, quote, the most extraordinary survival story belonged to, and we mentioned this earlier, Jesse Langford. Despite suffering burns over 90% of his body during his run through the crater, by December 30th, the 19-year-old was able to write a eulogy for his father, mother, and sister. From his hospital bed in Sydney, he watched a live stream of their funeral, at which his words were read out. The past weeks, and he said this, the past weeks have taught me that when times are tough, you have to find that inner strength that pushes you to persevere. You always have a bit more in you. And to that, I say I 100% agree with you, sir. And I can't think of anybody else who knows more or knows it
Yeah.
better.
So horrible.
As I mentioned, the volcano is closed indefinitely. I don't think they will ever open it again to tourism. I mean, maybe they will, but you can be certain there's going to be serious regulations to that.
Yeah.
In the end, I don't think it's up to the government much in terms of that island. The elders of the National Awa took the lead, and I think they should keep the lead. Within hours of the disaster, they placed a prohibition on White Island forbidding visits and fishing trips around the area. And that was within hours.
Yeah.
They were like, forget this. But not only that, but they arranged help for the families of some of the folks that were hurt, and they did a lot of stuff for them. And another thing I want to mention is that Mike, you had seen the documentary, the
Yeah.
newly married couple who ended up going on this trip. They're from Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, no way. I didn't even put that
Yeah.
together.
Yeah. I found that out in the article. I was like, what? And so that's obviously a tight connection with me. So I'm going to leave everybody with this quote about the helicopter pilots. And I think it's a good one because, it's how I would like to think I would live my life in that situation. I'm not saying I would. I'm not saying I'd be
Yeah.
brave like they are, but I'd like to think that if the call came, I'd be able to do it. And so the quote goes like this: those chopper pilots, what we did as a community, it came down to the difference between law and lore. Laws dictate to the pilots that it's too dangerous to go out there. You are not permitted to go. We are still assessing the situation. The pilots followed the lore or the heart. There were people there. They were in danger, and they didn't know the situation, but they just went. Taking risks could cost lives, no doubt, but the authorities had forgotten that it could save them too.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, if you're interested in learning more about this, the documentary on Netflix, I highly recommend it. It's called The Volcano Rescue from Whakaari. And also there's that article, The True Story of the White Island Eruption. And those are two sources that I just think do such a great job of
Yeah.
discussing exactly what happened. And it's not your, no offense to Newsweek or whatever. It's not that. It's not a top level discussion. This really gets in there, even that
Yeah.
article. And so that's White Island covered in ash, and it was really hard to watch. And my jaw was on the floor the entire time as I was trying to take notes.
I mean, it was so well done. but I needed multiple beers and multiple Kleenex to watch that show. Like it was rough. I think the part that really got me the most was I forget what his name is, the young guy that wrote the eulogy for his family.
Oh, Jesse Langford.
Yeah, that's it, Jesse.
Yeah.
When the eruption happened and he looked around and could see his parents, but his sister was just gone.
Just gone.
Just gone.
Absolutely gone.
So
And
likely fell into the lake. Like that's
yeah.
probably what happened, and no one will ever know.
And one of the things that I didn't put in here, but I will mention, and I'll summarize it, is that a few days later, by the time that they got there to actually rescue the rest of the bodies, it had turned out that there ended up being rain and a landslide and washed a lot of them out into the water.
Oh, geez.
And so they weren't even able to really recover a lot. And they actually had been able to recover, I think, Jesse's dad. But like they had tried to pull him into the boat and he ended up slipping out and he was gone. And so instead of recovering these bodies, they're just gone.
Oh, I missed that part. Was that just from the article?
That was from the article.
Yeah, okay, yeah,
And
that wasn't on the show.
So, and I know that for some people, it's like, closure's closure. You can find some kind of closure. But for some people, if there's no body, like it's hard to have closure.
Yeah.
And so not hopping in there, grabbing the bodies or pulling up the bodies and taking them back. And I understand you've got to protect your people, but not doing that does not help that situation out.
No, for sure.
And again, I know that there's a way, there's a benefit cost thing. And that's not cost in terms of money, but a cost in terms of lives, right? You don't want to create more loss by trying to save the folks that are lost. But it's hard for those folks to find closure if there's nothing there, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
And so, not to end this case on a low note, but
yeah,
that's where I'm ending it.
Aren't you glad we took a break from true crime?
Yeah, right? I'm just glad they closed it indefinitely. For tours right now.
Yeah, and it probably, you're right, it probably never will reopen. But I mean, like I said, as much as it's horrifying, I would probably still go visit there if it was open.
There's still
it's beautiful.
It's attractive to me in terms of seeing that different. I mean, it's literally like kind of like stepping on a different planet. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I hike in Garibaldi Provincial Park, which again, not currently active volcanoes, but every peak in the park is a volcano, and there is still a chance that they are not fully dormant, right? They could come back to life. And who knows, right? We're on the Ring of Fire. Like there's so many earthquakes here. It could happen. I mean, Mount St. Helens is not really that far away.
Not at all.
Right on the border of Washington and Oregon. And it's had one violent eruption just before I was born.
Yep.
And the cone was rising not that long ago, and I think it stopped now, but it happens. I mean, years ago, I went with my in-laws to the big island of Hawaii, and we went to the Hawaii Volcano National Park, whatever it's called. And where we went is no longer accessible by people because of that huge eruption. The lava lake is now no longer there. The visitor center we went to is no longer habitable. Like the ground is all cracked up. It is not safe. I mean, nature can be beautiful and violent.
Yep. And that's the moral. That's the moral of the story.
It's not just humans that are violent. Nature is too.
We'll see you next week for a less depressing episode.
I'm sorry to tell you that's wrong, actually.
I know it is. It really is. But yeah. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Mike's going to cover a couple of things for us.
Yes. Thanks for tuning in to Brew Crime. You can find us on all social media platforms at Brew Crime. We have a Facebook group, Brew Crime the Group. If you would like to support the show, head to patreon.com/brewcrime now. The money goes towards upgrading equipment and making the show that much better. You get one bonus episode a month, as well as early ad-free access to our episodes. Shout out to our Patreon supporters. Jay is rad. True Crime Nana, 3% podcast, and the faves of our lives. Bye. All cases on Brew Crime are written by Mike and JT or a writer we credit on the episode, and sources are put into our show notes for each episode. We always want to give credit to the people that research the cases we talk about. Check out our store at tpublic.com/stores/brew-crime-podcast, where you can purchase gear like t-shirts, phone cases, stickers, pillows, and all kinds of other cool stuff. Brew Crime's intro was created by Mike using Creative Commons Attribution licensed audio from purple-planet.com, soundbible.com, and freesoundeffects.com. Logo designed by Ben Greenberg. Thanks for listening to this episode of Brew Crime Podcast. Probably should push that.
I'm so glad you did. Yes, I am. I'm pulling out Burr.
Okay,
right
I will press intro.
Who's doing the intro?
Welcome to Brew Crime, the Poscar. Fuck.
Freya to Oh, I had it. The uninsured. I just got it. Well, I pee. I'm literally dying. I'm literally dying. I'll be right back. Oh my god.